Interlude. Tepeclan. Ichtak VI's entry into Tepeclan was just as grandiose as his entry in the wake of Estlan. The mood of the brooding city, however, could not have been more different. The crowds were just as massive, and the veneration just as genuine, but a shadow of anticipation hung over each and every wary soul in the capital's bustling streets. When the Industrial Council had been formed to better advise the throne on matters of mass production and commerce in the wake of Izel II's coronation, they had been given the privilege of declaring triumph when military campaigns were concluded, a symbolic representation of the deference they were meant to show to the legions of Sholoshahidi. But shots were still ringing out as the very last of the ravaging Ida were cast from Kushkotlan province in the north, and no Industrial Council proclamations of victory had yet been heard. Ichtak VI arrived of his own accord, at the head of all the combined Ektal legions sent north to aid Kushkotlan. The prince was dressed not for ceremony, but for war. It was a uniform he sported, not the paint and feathered crests of rulers long past. The same could be said for his Ektal escorts, bedecked with medals and ribbons awarded for prior service, tramping on booted feet towards the foot of Shahwitzul and the imperial palace below. It was not they who led the way into Tepeclan, however, but the dead of the Kushkotlan campaign who took pride of place. Opulent carts piled with offerings of highland wildflowers bestowed on them in the towns along the road from the front hauled the corpses of Tepeclan's war dead, already several thousand in number. Each had been carefully preserved for their final descent into the storied cenote at the center of their home city. The Ektal legionnaires had carried the heaviest of the fighting during the struggle in the Valley of the Valorous, and it made a solemn sight for the capital to see its honored dead so proudly displayed during their final ride to the underworld. One last reminder to a people who would soon be shaken to their core of exactly why the upheaval had to happen. In their wake came 1,000 caged Ida, hobbled to prevent escape, and destined for the bowels of the palace. They would make for fitting sacrifice, but only once the question of rule had been answered. Frantic did not begin to describe the rush of the past week. A coat had been here and there around the capital, speaking to official after official in an endless chain of interrogations and repeat interrogations. Much of it had been alien to him, new places and faces collaborating to exhaust his sleepless mind, but none had been as unsettling as the throne room. The imposing hall of warrior reliefs before the door had been bad enough, intimidating even to a man of Harakwe's cloth, but to kneel beside the dais of the Tlatoani was another thing entirely. The young priest's whole frame seemed to reverberate with nervous anticipation. Whatever was slated to be done about the prince with the information he had uncovered, Akoat did not see the point of his presence in the chamber. The entire purpose of the posting he'd received from the Inquisition last year was to remain unassuming, to gain access any other priest of Shahwitzul would never be able to gain. To bring him in now destroyed any prayer of future usefulness that might have remained after his conspicuous absence in the wake of the fighting in Kushkotlan. Her Highness almost certainly needed him here. Otherwise, she would not have called for him. But each minute spent waiting in silence for the man they all knew was coming made Akoat ever more certain he was more a slab of raw meat to bait the tiger than a tool to curtail it. Seated with her quaintly hounds upon the dais, flanked by her summoned priests, none save trusted Shakoat had shared words with her before the order to convene had been handed down. If Akoat's tutor knew anything, though, the wizened speaker of the word was not to show it. For the 100th time, he scoured his memory for anything he might have done wrong, any mistake that might warrant a reprimand. Akoat had never once questioned his orders, and had never once slipped in the execution of them. Letters had been intercepted, the clergy had been able to puzzle out the cipher used to write them, and a Coat's hand had always been the avenue by which the Ektal misplaced a royal missive for an hour or two. From that concealed pocket in the greatcoat, all this had been made possible. It had been the young aspirant to Coat, not venerable Shakoat, who pitched that the old escape tunnel behind the Prince's Hall of Remembrance be expanded during his absence in Estlan province, hoping to peer in upon his most private thoughts during Ichtak's solemn self-reflection before the eyes of his ancestors. Never had he imagined that Ichtak would bring the object of his lust into their sight, but he had not let the incident go unreported. Even if Ichtak had felt the weight of eternity's eye too heavily to actually do anything in his meditation chamber, a Coat had seen more than enough. He had heard more than enough. For all the pain it caused him to see his childhood friend slip so low in the eyes of Harakwe, and all the worry he harbored over what relaying his finds to the clergy would mean, a Coat had never questioned his duty. Shakoat and the priesthood had not just saved him from humiliation after his leg injury removed him from the Kalmakak academies, but had ever been the moral and philosophical bedrock of his empire. If Ichtak was to speak the word of Harakwe one day, then it was necessary he speak it truthfully and openly by the day of his ascension. Whatever the priesthood had to do to make sure he walked the path of self-discipline was worth the effort and the skulking. They had his findings, and they had his sworn word. What, then, could they ask of him now? What could he add in person which they did not already have to hand? Why did the throne room's opulent walls feel so much like a wire cage? Silence made the wait all the more excruciating, giving a Coat no chance to slip away from his thoughts and dissect the words of those around him. When the throne room door was at last thrown wide, and the booted Ichtak strode through, the noise upon the stones of the floor seemed one with thunder to his ears, making him twitch with each heavy footfall. Other lesser priests in the room were quite the same, averting their faces, waiting for the tense quiet to be broken by words. Praying the gazes of either royal in the chamber never fell upon them. The prince's burning eye was not for him, though. It was only the Tlatoani upon her dais that it stalked. Buried were the frightful nerves a Coat had witnessed throughout the years whenever the ruler's shadow was cast over her son. Now, the ruler's frosty poise was met with the upstart's fiery glare. "I could hear you coming through the hall," the Tlatoani mused. "You must have caused quite a stir outside, tramping a booted legion through the streets like that." A Coat could hear the tight-lipped smile behind the veil off to his side, not needing to see to feel the barbs. "Priestly sappers broke the forts along the border," said Ichtak, just as priestly hands laid the chemical charges that dragged the Ida from their barrows. "We've been attacked from within. I come only to find out how much you knew of the treachery before I avenge it." Ichtak's tone gave no quarter, not even acknowledging that the Tlatoani had spoken. He had not kowtowed before the dais, nor had he lowered his head. There was no pretense here, no artifice suggesting things might be reasoned out. "I've heard rumblings from the north saying as much," Izel replied, tone flippant, as if the newcomer had delivered her linens. "It's such a testament to Shiloshaishan efficiency that the Admiralty's intelligence office launched an investigation into that of their own accord, is it not?" "You've heard the reports," Ichtak said. "They were wired as I was passing the gates. You know what they say." Izel nodded, a Coat catching the slow gesture from the very corner of his vision. "Go on, then. Say what you've come to say." Ichtak's fists clenched, the leather gloves accompanying the uniform protesting under the strain. Akoat was prepared for an outburst, but the response was placid, measured just as his mother's had been. "I had believed the defender of Sholosha'idi would have something to say about it," said Ichtak. "I suppose I misjudged her." So shocked was Akoat to hear the Tlatoani spoken to in such a way, his eyes darted sideways. He half expected her to draw a weapon, to call in the Ektal guards outside the room, anything to punish impudence which was unheard of in so hallowed a chamber. Izel matched her son's composure, but she did not speak. The masses of Sholosha'idi would not look kindly on such deception, Ichtak told her. "I believe they have a word for those who would do such things. It is a word you've leveled at me." "Funny," Izel countered. "You'll speak to your own mother of heresy while your Lautani courtesan struggles with his binds under a mountain of love letters. The masses of Sholosha'idi would not look kindly on that either." Ichtak had to have known the push was coming, but his muzzle tightened, his teeth clenched beneath barely stilled lips. "I challenge Tlamakti." The whole room reeled at that. All had known it must be on the table, but none had truly believed it would come down to that bitterest of ends. Even Shakoat was wide-eyed, with only the Tlatoani keeping her glare centered, cool as a mountain cenote, beyond the cares of the frigid moment. "Harakwe's judgment," she said. "Somehow, that is very fitting." "Name your champion." Ichtak would not be distracted. The Tlatoani was a woman, not privy to the ancient, near-abandoned tradition of blood trial for the throne, meaning another would be needed to wield a blade in her stead. "Inquisitor Akoat," Izel said, not a moment's hesitation in the words. Ichtak's eye fell on Akoat, but the priest did not have the presence of mind to worry about it in the moment, his heart thumping as if attempting to escape his chest. He had nearly blacked out at the sound of his name, his head spinning as if he'd been physically knocked senseless. When he finally did meet Ichtak's gaze, the prince looked as confused as he, mystified, his eye narrowed as his mind rushed to process what this meant. "You will give me time to convene the families, won't you?" Ichtak, his head moving as if he had been drugged, turned and nodded his acceptance. Then he wheeled around, strode for the door, and pushed through into the hall, his clattering booted footfalls drumming on the stones of the palace floors. My death knell, Akoat thought to himself, watching as the doors blocked his old friend from view.